Some units suck in Total War Warhammer 2 through no fault of their own. And I'm not talking about the obvious crappy units like Peasant Mob or Skaven Slaves, I'm talking about units that are supposed to be good at something, but rarely can they make themselves useful, or they're simply overshadowed by superior options. So let's take a look at these 5 units, and 5 points to you if you can guess the units before the blurriness disappears. This first one is a unit I really want to love and I enjoy using when they work, but rarely does that happen. Their visual is awesome, but unfortunately it's just very difficult to get them to do any work. It is none other than WARPFIRE throwers for the Skaven. A very powerful unit if you can get them constantly firing, which almost pretty much never happens. The biggest problem for these rats is their range of only 80, which once you position them behind some friendly units to protect them, there's really only about 40 or 50 range being able to be used, which is very short and allows for about all of one volley of their warp fire. After that, the enemies will be engaged with your friendly units and you won't be able to blast at them anymore because fire obviously has a low firing arc. The only hope is that some ranged unit comes and stands within range and then maybe they'll be able to make themselves useful, but it's not hard for those units to get away. Here comes this unit of Chaos Marauders, here comes their one volley they can get off, which isn't even aimed very well, it's kind of at the edge of the unit, so that's kind of another thing that really limits them. They've done some decent damage on it though. Against light infantry, they will absolutely melt units if they can hit them. After this though, there's only really one choice to be able to get some fire on units, and that's to try and flank around. They're not the slowest unit in the world at 38 speed, but they're a bit cumbersome and obviously definitely don't want to go into melee. If you can get some clean shots on enemy light units, you will absolutely murder them, and they can definitely be powerful if you can make this happen. The trouble is that flanking is usually a bad idea with this kind of unit. Another problem, because of their short range, is that when you issue an attack order and the enemy unit moves back, they'll move forward to try and keep up with them, and they'll put themselves in some kind of obstructed position, like here, which means you have to reposition them to get them a good shot, which is just a lot of micro and hassle that you really don't need. Occasionally you may get opportunities present themselves, like here you get the back of a unit you can fire at, although these are Temple Guard with lots of armor, which is another problem for them as well. Because they don't have armor piercing damage, they don't do too well blasting away at armor. Even this Carnosaur is not going to feel too much damage from that warp fire flame. Although if some lightly armored monsters or flying units come along, this can be a place that they're very useful because they can fire up, they don't have to worry about the firing arc so much, and a lot of them will be able to fire, although these will be niche opportunities that may never materialize. So while this green warpstone flame looks goddamn awesome, rarely can they be worth their money, even though they're not that expensive. There's probably other units to spend the money on that you can get a more consistent performance out of. This next unit is one that's really overshadowed by just a more useful unit. Its ability can be useful, but it can also be kinda useless. It is none other than the Balefire Corpse card for the Vampire Counts. It's a unit that is rarely that useful, especially in campaign, as there is quite simply just a better option. Now if you don't know, the Balefire of this Corpse card, as you can see in the bottom left, reduces enemy recharge rate, and that gets amplified by the more enemy units that are nearby, up to 5. The problem with this is that it only has a 40 meter range, so if this thing comes along, it doesn't take very long for lords and heroes to run away from it to get out of range. Meaning it'll probably only have 1 or 2 units that it's having an effect on, which is going to reduce that recharge rate a little bit, but nothing that's really that significant. Maybe if it's an army that's really relying on its magic, it could have a pretty profound effect, but otherwise, most armies won't be too fussed that their recharge rate is just a little bit slower some of the time. Plus in campaign, the AI doesn't use its magic very well, so it's not something you really need to try and block by bringing one of these along. When it comes to the Corpse cart, you've got 3 choices available. The regular cheap Corpse cart, which comes with Vigor Mortis, increasing melee defense and melee attack of nearby friendly units. And then we have the Balefire version we've been speaking about. You've got the same ability as the previous unit, the Vigor Mortis, and of course the Balefire ability we were just banging on about, which maybe can have its uses in multiplayer here and there, but in campaign, it's probably not going to be that useful, especially when you compare it to the only slightly more expensive Unholy Lodestone version, which gives regeneration to nearby friendly units, as well as that Vigor Mortis. This is of course more useful everywhere, and healing is one of the most powerful tools we have in the game. So more often than not, you'll be better off choosing the Unholy Lodestone version of the Corpse cart than either of the other two, as it's only slightly more expensive than the Balefire version and can do a lot more. Naturally, being able to heal your nearby units while they're fighting is a very powerful ability, and that ability will stay useful for the entire battle while the corpse cart is alive. Whereas the Balefire version, that magical disruption is only useful while the enemy has magic. Once they've used up a lot of their magic and their recharge rate is really slow anyway, at like a minute or so, the extra 5, 10 or 15 seconds doesn't really make that much of a difference. So mostly because of the existence of the unholy lodestone version of the corpse cart, the Balefire corpse cart isn't really that great. The next unit is one that's never really found its place since its faction came into the game. They don't seem to be great at their job, and there are other units that just do their job better. It is none other than the animated hulks from the Vampire Coast. They're a unit that seems a little bit misplaced, as the Vampire Coast is all about using their ranged power. Very rarely does anyone try to bring a monster army to take their enemies down with when playing the Vampire Coast, which makes it difficult for this unit to really find a home. This could be down to some of their stats not being up to par, such as their armor only being 35 and their melee defense being 24, so they'll take damage fairly quickly. And although they have decent weapon strength and armor piercing, they don't have much for charge bonus or melee attack, so they don't actually hit as often as you'd probably like. They're also a bit overshadowed by Mongols, who have very much a similar setup: crappy armor and melee defense, decent weapon strength but a much better charge bonus and decent melee attack, also regeneration and stalk, so they're just all around better than the animated hulks. They are a fair bit more expensive, but you'd only ever be bringing 1 or 2 animated hulks anyway, as you would probably with Mongols. Their lack of melee attack makes their damage output pretty slow, which is difficult for them because they don't survive very long either with their low melee defense and armor. At least the Mongols have some regeneration to counteract their squishiness. Having them fight in amongst other friendly units can help them avoid some of that damage and help them last a bit longer, but even fighting Chaos Marauders here, they're just not really getting a lot of kills. Maybe they're a unit that just needs more support from magic and things to boost their melee attack to help them do a bit more damage or to survive a bit better. But that sounds like a lot of work, and you'd just be better off bringing Mongols, who bring a lot more to the table anyway. So while it's nice for the Vampire Coast to have a few monstrous unit options, this one just doesn't seem that useful. And like I said, in the Vampire Coast's missile heavy roster, there isn't that much of a place for them to be terribly useful. For the money, there are definitely better units to put in your army, whether in campaign or multiplayer, or you just fork out the extra and go for the Mongols instead. Because more often than not, animated hulks won't make your money back. Now for a unit that seems like it should be pretty useful with its unique selling points, but for the price you can probably get much better damage output from other units in the army. It is Hawk Riders for the Wood Elves, of course. A flying missile cavalry sounds wonderful, but is unfortunately kind of underwhelming. A strange minor issue with the Hawk Riders is their armor piercing melee damage, which is a great thing, right? Armor piercing damage, but they only have 18 melee defense and 15 armor. So while armor piercing damage is a nice touch, you're not going to get much damage out of it because of their melee defense and armor, which is fine. They're not necessarily supposed to be a melee unit. They're all about their ranged attack, of course. They've got pretty decent range and good missile strength, although there is only 18 of them in the unit. So damage output is fairly slow, and they need to stay alive for as long as possible to use up all of their ammo, and then maybe you'll get your money's worth. But the other problem with them is that they're not 360-degree firing. They can only fire in front of them. So if something pursues them, they will be pushed back and won't be able to fire. So if another flying unit comes after them, basically, they won't really do a lot. And if they get engaged in melee by something that's good in melee in the air, they're probably done for. So they're very squishy in melee. They can only fire as long as they're not being chased. And to throw one more downer on them, they lose to Goblin Archers in a one-on-one shootout. Now that is pretty embarrassing, especially for a unit that costs $950, taking on a unit that costs $375 in multiplayer costs. Naturally, this is just a bad matchup for them. They're not designed for taking on other missiles. But still, it's pretty bad. So for $950 cost, or a similar equivalent in campaign, you can get 1 unit of Hawk Riders. Or you could, for a similar price, get 2 units of Glade Guard, the cheapest kind. They'll not only have more damage output than the Hawk Riders, they'll do it faster as well. Or you could get 1 unit of Deepwood Scouts for around the same price, who at least have skirmish and can shoot their target while they're running away from it. Not quite the mobility of flying units, but probably better choices in the long run. So when they get on the battlefield, they really need to pick their targets to make the most of their ammo, as it's not armor piercing. Shooting at heavy armor or shields like these dragon princes is really going to be a waste of their ammo. You also got to hope that nothing tries to chase them, like this dragon here. Of course the dragon won't catch them, at least in most cases, but faster lords or heroes or units that will be able to catch them, or at least to push them back and keep them out of the fight, could render them utterly useless. Then they have the worry of enemy missiles. Pretty much any enemy missiles is going to do a good amount of damage to them if they focus them. In this case, nothing's really shooting at them, but if they did, they'd be gone pretty quick because of their lack of armor. So their key power is their mobility, but if they use it and get too close to enemy missiles, they'll get taken out, so they have to stay out of the way, but then they might get chased off, so it's difficult to find a good spot to use them. Your best bet to get the most out of them is to try and use up all their ammo on light targets, and then you'll only have your armor-piercing melee damage left, which you won't be able to do a ton with, but you could do something. You could go after the lighter troops, maybe you could go for some elite troops and try to get a bit of armor-piercing damage. There's going to be a judgment call there, but if you really want to go for this kind of skirmish plan, you're going to be better off doing it with Glade Riders probably, who cost less and have the 360-degree firing, so at least they can shoot at whoever's chasing them. So while Hawk Riders are a nice idea, they don't really get the money's worth very often, and there are simply better options. Another unit that's just never really seemed to have had a good place in the army roster, although on paper they sound like they should be a good unit and should have some good uses, but unfortunately they just don't. It is Black Ark Corsairs with HANDBOWS. Honestly, they probably shouldn't even be called Black Ark Corsairs because it makes you think they're a good damage dealer unit like the regular Black Ark Corsairs. But whether in melee or at range, they don't really excel at either of those things. Their problem mostly is that they sit in the middle of a lot of superior units. While regular Black Ark Corsairs are a damage dealer, the HANDBOWS really aren't. They're actually not as good in melee as Bleak Swords, the cheapest infantry on the roster. You can see the stat differences here on the card. Black Ark Corsairs unit is smaller, so it has less health and a small amount of health anyway because it's an elf unit. They do have more armor, but they have less melee defense, only 24, which means they take damage fairly quickly. And in a straight up one-on-one melee fight, the Bleak Swords will actually beat the Black Ark Corsairs. So don't make the mistake of using this unit in the same way that you would use the regular Black Ark Corsairs, because they are just not as good in melee and they don't have the bonus versus infantry like the regular kind, so they simply don't do well. And then when you think about their missile attack, which isn't armor piercing, and you compare it to the armor piercing Dark Shards with shields, there's really no comparison, and the Dark Shards are cheaper. One of the strengths of the Dark Elf army is their armor piercing missiles, so to bring the HANDBOWS with their short range and non-armor piercing damage just seems a bit silly. What's more is that if you're willing to fork out just a little bit more money, you can just get some Shades instead, who are exactly the same unit, just miles better at the job. Much better melee stats, as you can see, nearly twice the range, more missile strength, which is armor piercing. They still have the 360-degree firing, vanguard deployment and stalk, all for just a couple of hundred extra gold, which gives the Black Ark Corsair HANDBOWS really no place. If you want this kind of hybrid skirmish melee unit, spend the extra money and get Shades. You're getting a much better deal for your money. If you're looking to save money or you can't afford the upkeep on Shades, you're going to be better off going for Dark Shards if you want some more missile power, or even Bleak Swords if you want some melee power. Because Black Ark Corsair HANDBOWS sit in a strange spot where you never really seem to know what to do with them in a battle. Should I put them into melee now? Should I use them at range? Their range is so short I need to get them close to stuff, but if something chases after them they probably won't get away fast enough unless it's an infantry. So even with their 360-degree firing power, it doesn't really translate well into making them a good skirmish unit, which kind of defeats their object. Or you could try and use them as a flanking missile unit, but then they're exposed to cavalry and monsters and everything else, and if those get a hold of them, they have such low health that they're probably just going home anyway. So it's just best to send the Black Ark Corsairs packing, along with the WARPFIRE throwers, the Balefire Corpse Cart, animated Hulks, and Hawk Riders. So there you go. 5 units that kinda suck. Some of them should be good, but they just don't have a place, or you're simply getting better value for money with other units. There are a bunch more units that could have been in this video, of course, and maybe I'll do a second one of these. Thanks for watching, people. I hope you've enjoyed this. I will see you in the future.